In the final module, we're looking at what do you do if there's a breach of contract. And in this particular video, we're going to look at some of the equitable remedies that are available to non-breaching parties. So keep in mind, you also have the availability of suing for money damages. We've got compensatory damages that we can account for and prove up with evidence. We've got liquidated damages, which is a new form of damages that you haven't encountered yet. It's also damages. And remember, when we say damages, we're talking about money. But then there are some equitable remedies. And while this isn't the first time you've heard of equitable remedies in this course, these are very helpful in contract disputes, and they are used often. And there's a couple that you haven't encountered yet. So let's take a look at some of the equitable remedies available in breach of contract contexts. You may first wonder why we would want an equitable remedy at all, but in contract disputes, oftentimes, money damages, it would be inadequate or not fair to merely get money damages. It's just not going to make the parties whole. And so we have rescission and restitution, which are technically two different equitable remedies, but are often together, specific performance, and reformation. So rescission and restitution. First, rescission is putting the parties back to where they were in the positions they occupied before they entered into any kind of a transaction or this contract. And it is oftentimes used when the material breach, we're looking at a material breach, when it was on purpose, it was intentional or willful. And the court say, you know what, we're going to do this breach of contract, this breach was material and it was willful, we're just going to undo the whole thing. That is the rescission part. So as part of the rescission, you're putting people legally back in the places that they were before they entered into the transaction. Great, that's the great part of the remedy. But what about the down payment that was given? Well, we also need to restore that money too, and that's the restitution part. And you can maybe see why rescission and restitution are often two different remedies that are coupled together. Now, restitution is not limited to rescission cases, but you will almost always see some sort of restitution in rescission cases. So you can have restitution without a rescission. You can technically have a rescission without restitution if it's not necessary, but oftentimes you will see them together. Specific performance is new. And this is where a non-breaching party just really absolutely will not be made whole if we were only going to offer them money damages. And it's attractive to a non-breaching party because they get what they wanted in the first place. When you think of specific performance, I want you to think land. Land sales, real estate sales. What I want you to avoid thinking about in the context of specific performance is a court ordering someone to perform personal services against his or her will. It's likely not going to happen. So specific performance, think of the beautiful cabin on the side of a mountain with a perfect view. And you get all the way to closing and the seller decides, I'm going to breach the contract. I'm not going to actually transfer title. And you can have money damages, but I'm not going to transfer it. I want to keep it. And you say, no, I actually want that house. And so you go to a court and you ask the court to force them to transfer title like they agreed to do. That's specific performance. Reformation can be the equitable remedy for the friendly. It can also be used in unfriendly cases, but if you have an oral agreement and you've got this great idea and everyone's on board and you reduce that oral agreement to writing, you memorialize it, and it doesn't get written down right, there's maybe a clerical error or there's a decimal point that's moved a couple of places, there's something wrong and all the parties know it, you can ask a court to reform the contract and make it say what the parties really intended. Covenants not to compete are an example where a court might come in and reform a contract, not when there's a mistake, but where the contract went too far, but they don't want to undo the entire contract. So in an employment context, we use covenants not to compete to some degree, but mainly where I have seen this is when you're buying a business. So you have an individual or a group of individuals who wants to purchase an existing business. many times these businesses that are valuable just because the person who was the founder or who's running it is really good. And if that person were to sell you the business for $5 million and then the next day pick up next door and start doing the same business, that competition would devalue the sale of that business because there's a lot tied up in who that person was. And so as part of the sale, you have a part of the contract, a covenant not to compete. And so that person who had previously run the business agrees, for this fat check, I'm not going to compete with you for 18 months, and I will not compete with you for 18 months anywhere inside of Harris County. And that's probably going to be okay. A court might read one of those covenants not to compete, and it says, I'm not allowed to compete anywhere in the world for a period of 100 years. Well, that's absurd, but the court may say that's not going to fly, and they would reform it down to something that is reasonable. And if you are looking at reformation, that's not necessarily a mistake or a clerical error, but it's a covenant that went too far, but the rest of the contract is still good, and they don't want to undo the whole contract through rescission or something like that. They will just reform that stretch of text or that covenant, that limited portion, those 2 paragraphs. They will reform it to something more reasonable, and then that will be the ongoing contract that will be enforceable. So the final equitable remedy in the context of this chapter is actually not available for breach of contract. Technically, it's not available for breach of contract. Why? Because quasi-contract itself is where the court makes up a fiction and treats the parties as if there was a contract, but it only can be applied by a court if there isn't actually a legal contract in issue. So the other forms of equitable remedies, rescission, restitution, reformation, and specific performance, those are equitable remedies available, if at all, for the breach of contract, which assumes a contract exists. Quasi-contract is an equitable remedy itself, and it is used by a court, this legal theory is used by a court when there isn't a contract, but maybe there should have been. So keep that straight, and you're well on your way. I hope this helps you think about what most people actually spend most of their time thinking about when they're dealing with contracts after they've been breached, is what kind of remedies are available. It's one thing to say, well, you shouldn't have done that, or you did this and you failed to do this, and get in a dispute, but at the end of the day, what are the remedies available to the business or the business persons or you as an individual? What can you get? What can a court force the breaching party to do, to refrain from doing, and how much money can you get, and is that money going to be enough to make you whole, or should you seek maybe one of these other equitable remedies?